Hello, my name is Chris, and today we're going to be discussing the three groups of people who were victims of oppression during the 18th and 19th century. During this time period, the United States was going through a period of change. This seemed very different when you compare it to 20th and 21st century America. Racism and unfairness was rampant throughout these times. Basically, if you were not a white male, you had little to no rights. The following will be examples of just how unfair life was for these three groups of people. Starting with women. Throughout most of this period, women were paid less than their male counterparts working alongside them. This created great financial difficulties for working women. Oftentimes, women's wages were thought of as a secondary earning and less important than men's wages, even though they were crucial to the family's survival. Women were not allowed to vote, hold office, serve in a jury, or be an accountant, or be a lawyer. There was also societal norms, and women were expected to be a certain way. It was frowned upon for a woman to be too educated. The name they gave to these women were blue stockings. They were considered unfeminine and off-putting. Some doctors even reported that too much study actually had a damaging effect on the ovaries, turning attractive young women into dried-up prunes. They were also expected to wear many layers of clothing that weighed a lot. This weight caused issues over time. A well-dressed woman of the late 19th century wore 37 pounds of clothing in the winter, 19 of which hung from her corseted waist. Women lost even more rights when they were married. Upon marriage, women became property of their husbands. A remnant of this can still be seen today when a woman takes her husband's surname. After being married, the man assumes absolute ownership of his wife's personal property, and for all practical purposes, her real estate as well. He also gained control of any wages or other income accrued by his spouse. This technically meant that the man could do anything he wished with his wife's material possessions. Also, once married, a woman could not make contracts, devise wills, take part in legal transactions, and the only benefit they had was that their husband was obligated to pay off any of their debt. Divorce was very unfashionable in general at the time. It was still possible for men to divorce their wives for a variety of reasons, like them failing to look after their needs properly, or if they commit adultery. It wasn't until halfway through the century, 1857, that women could divorce an abusive husband. A woman was merely seen as a way of enhancing the social status of her husband. Minor versus Happersett, 1875, is a United States Supreme Court case in which the court held that the Constitution did not grant anyone, in this case specifically a female citizen in the state of Missouri, a right to vote, even when the state allowed it. They had refused to register a woman as a lawful voter because that specific state's law allowed only men to vote. Virginia Minor, a leader of the women's suffrage movement in Missouri, attempted to register to vote on October 15, 1872, in St. Louis, Missouri, but was refused due to her being a woman. With the assistance of her husband, Francis Minor, a lawyer, she brought an action in state courts against Reese Happersett, the person who had rejected her application registered to vote, alleging that the provisions of the Missouri State Constitution, which allowed only men to vote, were in violation of the United States Constitution, and specifically the 14th Amendment. The court said that the second section of the 14th Amendment referred specifically to male citizens and concluded that this clearly recognizes the right and seems to anticipate the exercise of the right on the part of the states to restrict the right of suffrage to the male inhabitants. Now on to the oppression of the Native Americans. Native Americans were not seen as U.S. citizens throughout the 19th century. Despite their welcome to serve in the Union Army, another form of oppression would be a clause found in the 14th century amendment excluding Indians not taxed, that prevented Native American men from receiving the right to vote when African American men gained suffrage back in 1868. Another way Native Americans were oppressed during this period was Andrew Jackson's Removal Act. Even after citing the French in the French and Indian War, they were eventually forced out of their home under the act. Consequently, Native American populations were diminished in size and territory by the end of the 19th century. Another fashion in which they were oppressed not only came in the form of the government squelching Native American uprisings, but also to stop the cultural traits from being passed to younger generations by assimilating them in board schools. These schools took in Native American children and attempted to erase every trace of their former Native American life. They received an American education and were also given American clothes. While at the school, the Native Americans were required to perform manual labor to contribute to the upkeep of the school, but were not allowed to be compensated for the work. Once they returned home, Native American children struggled to relate to their families after being taught that it was wrong to speak their language and practice their religion. Yet another form of oppression experienced by the Native Americans is the Trail of Tears. In the 1830s, Native Americans still lived in their native lands for the most part. However, white men considered them a threat to peace. So, in 1838, the federal government had what they called 5 civilized tribes removed. These tribes were the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. They were moved at a forced march up to 800 miles from their homelands to the Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma. Under cruel conditions, the army forced the peaceful tribes through the cold, winter weather to their new homes. During this ordeal, known as the Trail of Tears, over 4,000 Cherokees alone died out of the 15,000 moved. They died due to disease, exposure, and starvation.
This war did not spring up on our land. This war was brought upon us by the children of the Great Father who came to take our land without a price, and who, in our land, do a great many evil things. This war has come from robbery, from the stealing of our land.
Quote, Spotted Tail. Even when the Indian Territory was reached, the U.S. government was not satisfied. Slowly, more and more land was taken from the Native American tribes. A government who maintained ideas of equality and freedom were showing that these ideas were obviously did not pertain to everyone. In 1902, several 100,000 acres were cleared out of the white settlements. In 1907, the Indian nation ceased to exist, and when Oklahoma became a state, all Native American territory was assimilated into the Union. Now, on to the African American experience of oppression. Were blacks offered the same rights as free whites? The answer is, of course not. It extends much farther than the segregation of white water fountains. For example, Virginia law, passed in the early 1830s, prohibited the teaching of all blacks to read or write. Free blacks throughout the South were banned from possessing firearms, preaching the Bible, and so on. Later laws even prohibited Negroes who went out of the state to get an education from returning. Most horrifically, free blacks could not testify in court. If a slave catcher claimed that a free African American was a slave, the accused could not defend himself in court. Despite laws which forbade blacks from preaching, the church suffered brutalities and massive arrests in its memberships, clearly an indication of the fear of black solidarity. Many of these leaders became diehard abolitionists too. As the Civil War began, not only was slavery illegal in the District of Columbia, but racially discriminatory black codes impinged into the lives of free African Americans, forcing them to carry passes, stay inside at night, and pay unfair licensing to work in certain businesses. The threat of sale into the interstate slave trade hung over all African Americans in the region, enslaved and free. By the end of the war, slavery had been outlawed not just in DC, but nationwide. African American men had served with valor in the United States Army and Navy, and black organizations had come out onto the open, playing visible roles in the city's civic life. Quote, black codes in the antebellum South strongly regulated the activities and behavior of black, especially free blacks, who were not considered citizens. The codes deprived them of the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, the right to own or carry weapons, and in some cases, even the right to rent or lease land. Although slavery had been outlawed by the 13th Amendment, it effectively continued in the southern states. Oppression also took place in the courtroom. For example, the very unfair Supreme Court trial of Dred Scott versus Sandford. When a slave petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court for his freedom, the court ruled against him, also ruling that the Bill of Rights didn't apply to African Americans. If it did, the majority ruling argued, then African Americans would be permitted, quote, the full liberty of speech in public and in private, end quote, start quote, to hold public meetings upon political affairs, end quote, and, start quote, to keep and carry arms wherever they want, end quote. In 1856, both of the justices in the majority and the white aristocracy they represented found this idea too horrifying to contemplate. In 1868, the 14th Amendment made it law. What a difference a war makes. Another way the life of an African American had an extreme disadvantage is illustrated in Frederick Douglass' famous 1852 speech. Exposing the hollowness of American freedom values, he mentions that he is speaking about slavery after a good amount of paragraphs into the speech. Start quote, "What, to a slave, is 4th of July, a day that reveals the injustice and cruelty which he is the constant victim," end quote. He speaks on how a lot of things in America perpetrate slavery. Start quote, excuse me. "The existence of slavery in this country brands your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie," end quote. Out of all three groups, which one would I think had the worst experience with oppression in the 18th and 19th century North America? I would probably say the African Americans. Why? Because originally they were shipped from Africa forcibly, then put into slavery for such a long time. They had the most limitations in terms of what they can do, and it just seemed like they had the worst lives. They were also susceptible to, even if they were free, they were still susceptible to being captured and turned into slaves, which you cannot say was very likely for the other two, at least compared to the African Americans. They were not seen as humans as well by others, and that's pretty bad.